So I've been working on this video/audio essay talking about hyper-individualism and how people will rationalize any sort of behavior which they believe gives them an advantage over others. And I had to take a break. Not that it was becoming too unfocused or long-winded either, but what happened is, for each example I provided in my argument, there was always an additional one I'd use from this YouTuber, Academy of Ideas, which justified every single point I was trying to make, funny enough. In the essay, AOI talks about the dangers of collectivism and seems to defend every negative behavior I'd outlined for my upcoming work, The Gospel of Selfishness. I clearly had a lot to say about this creator and their philosophy, and had never done any proper reviews in general, mostly just musings of how I feel about different subjects or people. So I figured, why not make it a standalone thing, you know? So consider this an exercise in criticism and media literacy, where I give my personal opinion and commentary on Academy of Ideas while citing their work, which, as far as I know, is still protected under the U.S. Fair Use Rule. So I hold no ill will of AOI, but I do stand firm in my assessment of their work and the conclusions I come to, at least until I hear or see evidence which proves me wrong. So expect the Gospel of Selfishness in the near future, but in the meantime, I hope you enjoy my critique of Academy of Ideas and their video essay, How the Greater Good is Used as a Tool of Social Control.
The great citizens of a country are not those who bend the knee before authority, but rather those who, against authority if need be, are adamant as to the honor and freedom of that country.
So this quote is from Albert Camus, an Algerian writer and philosopher of the 20th century, who helped develop the theory of existentialism in his works. Existentialism, for those unfamiliar, is a philosophy that is largely dealing with the meaning of existence and how an individual can find meaning in a seemingly meaningless life. Right from the jump, there's something I want to point out that's going to be relevant to this entire review, and it's just an observation about Academy of Ideas' style of video essay. I've been watching their content for several years now, so I feel very confident in being able to summarize it as follows, but all of their work seems to read as fifth graders' introduction to philosophy. They seem to really love nothing more than cherry-picking these quotes from notable figures throughout history, and while they may come from different disciplines and have been very influential in their times, as well as in the modern era for some of them, he refuses to engage with the cultural, historical, or scientific context which influenced these people's observations. He's going to jump from point to point, and along with the evocative imagery that they use, which you're going to see if you're following the video review, relies more on appeal to emotion and poetic flourish as opposed to critical analysis to add a sense of gravity to their claims. Just something to keep in mind as we go along.
Instead of respect for reason, open dialogue, freedom of speech, and individual and property rights, political systems across the world are becoming increasingly authoritarian. How do politicians continue to convince the public to do away with their freedoms in favor of heavy-handed government control? Why are so few people defending liberty when a world absent of it is a world of mass suffering? In this video, we are going to examine these questions.
So did y'all catch all that? Let me break it down for you. So in our first major claim from Academy of Ideas, they state that the rights and privileges of citizens around the world are being threatened by authoritarian regimes that are stifling freedom of speech, silencing critics, taking people's resources and individual rights, etc. Now, I think no matter what one's political affiliation is, or even if you are apolitical, that it's hard to look at current events happening anywhere in the world and not agree with this sentiment, at least to some degree. However, notice that they will not specify what ideology or affiliations are driving these people to act as they do, because it's clear that from the US to Europe, Brazil, India, Nigeria, China, and other places where such threats to democracy are happening in real time or already occurred, the common thread between those in power in these countries is they are mostly far-right populists, or fascists in other words, and that those whom are resisting these figures are far-left and center-left, or centrist liberals, to put it in other terms. Because to highlight this fact would be to show his full hand, and which side of the aisle that Academy of Ideas truly stands on. This is even more obvious in the way in which he chooses to close the argument, citing yet another quote from Albert Camus' Resistance, Rebellion, and Death, a collection of essays in which Camus criticizes authoritarianism, but from a staunch left-wing perspective.
If freedom is regressing today throughout such a large part of the world, wrote Albert Camus, this is probably because the devices for enslavement have never been so cynically chosen or so effective, but also because her real defenders, through fatigue, through despair, or through a false idea of strategy and efficiency, have turned away from her.
And this isn't guesswork either, because Camus was an outspoken card-carrying socialist. He criticized Stalin's USSR and Mao's Communist China for the brutality and suppression of their citizens, and organized workers' unions in theater so he could educate actors on the values of socialism itself. Mind you, I haven't even read Camus' work. I didn't even do a deep dive biography. I just browsed different sources, including Wikipedia, which all corroborated this basic information about his life. And less than 90 seconds into their review, it's obvious that Academy of Ideas is much more concerned with reaching his conclusion without having to show any real work or give away what his biases are. So let's continue and see where he goes from here.
It is often said that one cannot solve a problem if one is not even cognizant of it. Many people still believe themselves to be free, and as Goethe wrote, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. Those who believe themselves to be free disregard the fact that to be governed in the modern world is to be watched, inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, by beings who have neither the right, nor the wisdom, nor the virtue to do so.
Now, I'm not going to stop and explain every single person that Academy of Ideas includes in their video. It doesn't age well, and I've only endured it for this long because I'm a person that naturally thrives on cringe and bad takes, whatever form they happen to come in. Though I will provide citations so you can go look them up for yourself. But a hint to all content creators out there, whatever medium you work in, you need to remember the importance of juxtaposition. Or in other words, actually give a fuck to show that you checked your own sources and that they complement one another. Because Goethe was a German writer, diplomat, and amateur scientist during the time of the US and French revolutions. He was skeptical of the French Revolution but showed full-throated support for the US Revolution, which preceded it. He also labeled himself a classical liberal, which basically makes him a Republican, being economically liberal but socially conservative. The second quote that AOI provides at the end of this claim is from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was a French socialist, considered the father of anarchist political theory and a member of parliament following the 1848 revolution, which ended one of France's remaining constitutional monarchies. Now, Goethe and Pierre-Joseph's lives were separated by almost a century, and while they were not polar opposites, operating both within liberal democratic institutions to varying degrees, they clearly had differences in ideology that would have put them at odds in their own time as well as ours. The failure to consider juxtaposition in this manner often exposes a lack of attention to detail and gives the impression that a creator assumes their audience to be too lazy to actually look up the sources and double-check them. And hell, given the consistency of their viewership and audience engagement, maybe they're right to assume as much, and that their audience really is better off without any citations. Ugh. Anyway, let's continue.
Accepting our lack of freedom is a necessary step to counteract this undesirable condition. For so long as we remain in denial of the chains of servitude that are upon us, we will do nothing to cast them aside. But widespread ignorance as to the lack of freedom is not the only reason why freedom is retreating from the world. There is also an idea that has infected many minds, and this idea, if not defeated, could prove to be the kiss of death for freedom in our generation. This idea is collectivism. To understand what collectivism is, we must consider the question: does the individual exist for the sake of society, or does society exist for the sake of individuals? Those who adhere to collectivism believe that the individual exists for the sake of society, and therefore that the individual has to subordinate himself to and conduct himself for the benefit of society, and to sacrifice his selfish private interests to the common good.
Say the
logical fallacy.
Bart!
False equivalency.
So in the second major claim, Academy of Ideas states that there's widespread illusion of freedom, and that if not defeated, the real freedom that we all cherish could be irrevocably lost in this generation, and this is 2020 in which I'm making this video, due to citizens being brainwashed by collectivism. No society can exist based just on one system. Even today, as alternatives to capitalism like socialism and communism become more mainstream, it should be understood that all modern economies use a mixed approach, such as publicly funded infrastructure, schools, and research, mandatory and voluntary military service, centrally planned and privately owned business interests in the economy, etc., with different configurations from the national level to the local level in every society. So this is not only a logical dead end, it's ahistorical and doesn't reflect the complexities of human civilization. It's just fear-mongering around the idea of collectivization, which isn't brainwashing that's an attempt to make every individual want to sacrifice themselves at any given moment for the collective, but a general understanding that there are benefits to collaborating with others and pooling our collective resources and actions together so as to guarantee survival in an ever-changing world. The choice between individual freedoms and collective safety has always been a false one. Make no mistake. And it's been used to justify a long list of wars and interventions, rolling back the rights and privileges of a country's citizens, and encouraging discrimination towards entire groups of people, using them as whipping posts for any perceived threat they may pose to another demographic. And by the way, this quote at the end of his argument is from Ludwig von Mises, who was an Austrian school economist and classical liberal, wink wink, and an early inspiration for the libertarian political philosophy. And I'm just going to leave that there.
This collectivist mindset is foundational to communism, fascism, and socialism. The doctrine of collectivism has been put into practice by many dictators such as Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Pol Pot, and Mao. Death, destruction, and suffering on a mass scale was the end result in each case. How does placing the good of society above the good of the individual tend towards such unfortunate outcomes? At first glance, collectivism may seem to be a virtuous position to take.
So is it clear to y'all now why I referred to this whole dude style as being fifth graders' introduction to philosophy? I should have included in there history, psychology, sociology, media literacy, critical thinking, and debate. This dude really is just a walking meme. This is meme logic. This is just one step removed from the Nazis were socialists because they call themselves National Socialist trope. But I guess now is as good a time as any to break down these ideologies for those still unfamiliar. So, communism and socialism. They're both left-wing anti-capitalist economic theories with meaningful differences between them, but concerning their shared qualities, both theories propose that life could be vastly improved if we abolished commodity-based markets on things such as food, housing, and energy, distributed profits and resources amongst the laboring class, not the investment class, separation of church and state, and secularizing the culture at large, encouraging more democratic decision-making by the nation's citizens, especially through labor unions, and fostering a more cooperative society no longer burdened with the profit motive. Fascism, on the other hand, is a right-wing pro-capitalist ideology that proposes life could be improved by machismo and the spread of military culture in civilian society, no separation between church and state, or at least limiting it, conspiracies about restoring the lost glory of one's country, and suppressing those conspirators, whom most often end up being women, minorities, academics, and the media, protecting corporate and private businesses, especially those who support the government, and all fascists, from Francisco Franco to Sukarno to Pinochet to Idi Amin, were violently anti-communist and anti-socialist, because capitalism is the literal fuel they need to fund their various projects and indulgent lifestyles, as well as for paying off the conspirators that they have that are helping them to maintain their grip on power. Then, of course, there's the well-known obsession with racial purity and hierarchy that is also central to many fascist-leaning figures. So it's almost laughable that anyone will claim the ideologies of, say, Stalin and Hitler are one and the same, when one of them is proposing they should be dominating the other as the literal rightful heirs to all of Earth's resources and human labor.
But on closer investigation, a philosophical error called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness corrupts the practical application of this ideology. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness occurs when one treats what is merely an abstraction as an entity that exists in the real world. Collectivism, in claiming the individual must sacrifice his or her private interests for the sake of society, takes what is merely a concept, society, and treats such a concept as if it had a concrete existence. In contrast to the individual that has a real existence in the world, society is an abstraction used to represent an ever-changing collection of individuals living and interacting in proximity. As far and as wide as one looks, one will never find a concrete entity called society that we can point to and identify in the manner analogous to how we can identify an individual. Society does not exist apart from the thoughts and actions of people. It does not have interests and does not aim at anything. The same is valid for all other collectives. Or as Carl Jung put it, as a society is a concept, it cannot think, act, speak, or choose, and therefore an individual or a group of individuals must be granted the ability to define the so-called societal greater good, and then granted the power to force individuals to act in service of this good.
This is interesting, because if this was the first time I was hearing this sort of argument, I would think the speaker was just being so ironically contrarian they had ascended beyond parody or satire or genre altogether, because of just how utterly detached they were from reality. But really, the truth is, this dude doesn't seem to have an original thought in his head. I mean, like, what the fuck is he really trying to say here? If we were to apply this bizarre logic to individualism, then you would come to the same conclusions that you would with collectivism. Because human beings in a vacuum won't have much in the way of skills, knowledge, or experience. Because human development itself is dependent on learning from past generations, engaging with one's current generation and being refined amongst your peers, and passing down those lessons to generations which follow. All of which creates this chain known as civilization. You know, kind of like language and music, or economic trade, or laws and regulations on food, air, and water. All of these things don't exist per se in the material world, but developed by humans as an effective means of passing on information, settling disputes, or establishing guidelines on proper conduct with one another. It's our relationship to one another and these ideas or tools which make not just the individual, but also the collection of human efforts. The world we know today wasn't just created by this select group of bratty, delusional sociopaths who were the true producers of everything valuable in our lives. The system is rigged, every single one, and power does what it does best, reinforces itself for as long as possible, and shutting down any opposition. Meanwhile, these same people who are rigging the system are going to look down at everybody else asking, what's your problem? Why don't you work harder? Why don't you pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Meanwhile, they pass on these same delusions of grandeur and entitlement to their friends and family through wealth, assorted privileges, and seats of power, regardless of how qualified they actually are for that position in the first place. And just to make this point even more clear, I'm not bullying Academy of Ideas. You put ideas out there and people are welcome to criticize them. But I especially don't like misappropriation and misinformation, which they commit throughout their content, and especially in how they abuse the idea of fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This idea was developed by mathematician Alfred Whitehead, and he used it to explain how humans overly focus on the supposed essence or definition of another person, idea, or object, and ignore the relationship to it, which in his mind was of more importance than any other facet of the relationship. Or in other words, it's not about what a thing is, it's about how it relates to everything else. So as we move on to the next major claim from AOI, and yet another cherry-picked quote provided without any context, I want to focus on their own words from the beginning and end of this argument. And then I'm going to provide the quote from the middle section and give you the background on its author. But make no mistake, I'm also underlining this claim in particular as well as the one that immediately follows it, because it's the most revealing about AOI's true beliefs and which side of the issue he truly stands on. It's also going to explain why he's been so dogmatic in his approach to describing collectivism and all these possible ills, but then never providing any counter-arguments to his appraisal of individualism and its possible downsides.
Since the dawn of civilization, it has been ruling classes who anoint themselves the arbiters of the greater good, and so not surprisingly the greater good, more often than not, merely amounts to the good of those in power. Contrary to the philosophical trickery promoted by collectivism, Neither the greater good of society, nor the state, nor any other concept used to describe a symbiosis of human beings is superior to flesh and blood individuals, whose spontaneous actions are the real creative and generative force in the world.
Now these words from AOI themselves present a major contradiction underpinning their whole philosophy, right? Because how can society, on one hand, be an abstract idea with no purpose or function because it's just describing a collection of people, and in another instance, also be this destructive force when influenced by collectivism, threatening any sense of individual freedom that has been developed from democratic ideals and ideals of liberalism and etc., right? I believe this is far more confessional than AOI would ever admit to. What immediately comes to my mind after hearing those words in the context in which they're presented is one of the many tenets of fascism. And before you think I'm being overdramatic, let me quote Italian philosopher and social critic Umberto Eco, who made some observations about fascism in the 20th century and recognized some of the typical elements of this belief system. Of his 14 major points, it is the following which sticks out to me the most. Quote, "The enemy is both weak and strong." Quote, or to paraphrase here, using shifty rhetoric, the fascists will insist they are the victims of a conspiracy by their opponents, whom are seeking to overthrow the status quo because they are weak, seeking to consolidate power for themselves, but also crushing any opposition to the status quo because they are already the ones that have a monopoly on power in every domain of life. Now peep the author as well as the quote used by AOI to defend their claim here.
Or as the 20th century psychologist Nathaniel Branden wrote, "With such collectivist systems, the individual has always been a victim, twisted against him or herself and commanded to be unselfish, in sacrificial service to some allegedly higher value, called God, or Pharaoh, or Emperor, or King, or society, or the state." From the first individual, who was sacrificed on an altar for the good of the tribe, to the heretics and dissenters burned at the stake for the good of the populace, or the glory of God, to the millions exterminated in slave labor camps for the good of the race or of the proletariat. It is this collectivist morality that has served as justification for every dictatorship and every atrocity, past or present.
Nathaniel Branden was a Canadian psychotherapist whose work was primarily focused on self-esteem. During the 50s and 60s, however, he was mostly focused on being the pupil, acquaintance, and eventually lover to writer and philosopher Ayn Rand, famous for developing her theory of objectivism in works like Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Now, Rand, in her own words, described objectivism as the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity and reason as his only absolute. It's a theory expressed in the words of Nathaniel here, framing the concept of self-sacrifice and delaying gratification as a direct assault on the freedoms and liberties of the individual, and is for some reason inherent to all systems of collectivism in human society. What Ayn Rand created, and figures like Nathaniel Branden helped promote, was a gospel of selfishness. It's a defense of pure unchecked ego in framing the achievements of the individual as morally righteous, as well as their desires. And the influence of this philosophy cannot be understated, as right-wing and far-right politics in the United States and beyond have been shaped by these principles. This includes the infamous Koch brothers, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, right-wing politicians like Ron Paul and son Rand Paul. By the way, I'm sure you can probably guess where Rand got his first name from at this point. And gamers were introduced to this concept in BioShock.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I chose something different. I chose rapture.
Where the player explores an underwater wasteland created to prove the merits of objectivism and failed miserably, creating worse conditions than would have occurred in a collectivist-based society, which they were trying to not recreate. So in this review, I'm going to provide just one more claim from Academy of Ideas that reinforces my criticisms of them and really just shows mask off what they truly are. It's even more blatant than the last one.
As the 19th century British philosopher Oberon Herbert wrote, "The individual is king, and all other things exist for the service of the king." Or as he further explained, "The individual is included in many wholes: his school, his college, his club, his profession, his town or county, his church, his political party, his nation. But he is always greater than them all. All these various wholes, without any exception, exist for the sake of the individual. They exist to do his service. They exist for his profit and use."
This irrational fear of collectivism, or the social good, the greater good, expressed by Academy of Ideas and other like-minded figures, is based on a fear of losing privileges, or at the very least, having to share them with those whom are seen as undeserving of these privileges. It's a fear of equality, because equality breeds competition, and competition is based on skills, on merit. If you don't actually have the skills and merit to prove why you have certain privileges or why you have certain entitlements, there's really no justification for why they should continue to be offered to you and not somebody else who's actually showing and proving themselves. Unless, of course, you see yourself as a beneficiary of the status quo, in which case I understand that anyone who is seeking to disrupt it would be naturally demonized beyond parody or satire could ever produce. They threaten your access to the privileges and rights which you see yourself entitled to. You're supposed to hate them. You're supposed to be anti-collectivist. So it all makes sense, really.
The conviction that the individual is king informed the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries, and led to a rapid awakening to the vital connection between freedom and the individual rights of life, liberty, and property. Generally speaking, individual rights specify that the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental or spiritual.
Damn. Folks, I don't think it gets any more clear than that. It's obvious what this dude is about and why collectivism, of all things, poses such an existential threat in the mind of Academy of Ideas, as well as many of the figures that he cites to defend his position. What AOI purposefully fails to mention here, as they do with all of their citations throughout this essay, is the context in which these ideas of the Enlightenment, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, were developed. They didn't spontaneously just come to the minds of people who already had these things and just needed words to describe them. They were set in contrast to the prevailing dominance of monarchies as well as the church. Kings and queens, working alongside established religious figures such as the Pope, hoarded the overwhelming majority of wealth, resources, and land, on which peasants had toiled in exchange for measly wages and no guarantees of privacy or participation in the government, no ability to negotiate the terms of their economic situation, and really no personal autonomy. And just like with all of their citations that AOI provides, the absence of information is by no means an accident. It's impossible to go through looking through any of these events like the Enlightenment or any of these figures such as Albert Camus or Nathaniel Branden and be able to pull all of these different quotes and places and times in history in which they existed without coming across the bits of info that I gleaned just from my short browsing sessions. This is pretty impressive, actually. It's rare that you have somebody like Academy of Ideas who will all at once undermine the pretentious title which they bestowed upon themselves, as well as the entire ethos of their content mill, but the very arguments that they are trying to make in this work they stand behind full-throatedly. Despite his calm and restrained delivery, it's clear that he is an emotional wreck and deeply paranoid about the world around him, providing all of these historical events and figures without any of the context on why they were important or worthy of discussion, and all of the points that he uses to bolster his arguments seem to contradict the ones that directly preceded them or followed. Overall, this is leaving a really incoherent worldview that nevertheless is supposed to incite a sense of urgency in the listener or the true believer. But that's actually the point.
Those who support individual rights are not motivated by an insensitivity to the plight and suffering of others, but rather by the recognition that in granting each of us the freedom to pursue our own good, social cooperation, the division of labor, and a prosperous society emerge in a bottom-up manner, and thus the ability to help others also improves. For without the wealth-generating mechanism of freedom, all the good intentions in the world will not clothe, house, and feed the poor. Collectivists claim the opposite. An emphasis on the rights of the individual, they suggest, rather than on the greater good, tends to inhibit social cooperation and promote an atomized population in which every man and woman is an island left to fend for themselves. But here collectivists have it backwards. We are naturally social animals, and so the atomization of individuals only results when a government, under the guise of the greater good, is granted the power to enforce social isolation, or else to sow the seeds of fear and suspicion amongst friends and neighbors.
Because it's not like laissez-faire capitalism and hyper-individualism can be blamed for any ills of the modern world, right? Not for the ecological destruction, for famines and other resource scarcity, not for technological stagnation, for poverty, homelessness, not for enabling the worst sides of human nature, not for all the wars and interventions and the deaths that have resulted from the various arms races, including for nuclear armaments. Yeah, none of that can be blamed on capitalism, I guess. It was only the collectives, the people who wanted to band together and be like, hey, maybe we should go tell these other people who are hoarding all the resources and making all of these decisions that affect all of us that we actually matter too, and we're not going to take this shit anymore. Folks, I don't think it gets any more clear than that. It's obvious what this dude is about and why collectivism, of all things, poses such an existential threat in the mind of Academy of Ideas, as well as many of the figures that he cites to defend his position. He is, at the very least, a right-wing libertarian, making allusions to the non-aggression principle, limited government intervention in social and economic issues, all the while presenting greed and selfishness as acts of virtue rather than vice. In worst-case scenario, he's a shy fascist, with his slippery false comparisons between fascism and communism as well as socialism, talking of grand conspiracies without providing any evidence or examples, all the while framing these conspirators as being both too weak and too strong to be ignored. I guess there is also a third option though, right? In that Academy of Ideas is simply a grifter, playing off of the insecurities and genuine concerns that any citizen would have looking out at the world around them or simply their neighborhood, and offering nothing more than a one-stop shop of coping mechanisms for those who can look at all of these issues and think, I think the solution here is more egoism, more selfishness, more putting the individual, their desires, and their satisfaction above that of the collective. And if you think I'm misguided, hey, please let me know. But I feel pretty confident in my analysis of AOI's video essay and their general point of view, and backing it up with the claims and citations which they were too lazy or unwilling to provide. They make several other claims in this video essay, but this review was already going on long enough, and it was taking longer to complete than I anticipated. However, if you're a glutton for cringe and shitty philosophical arguments like I am, I have a review of the entire video, which I'll make available on my Patreon for a small donation. I have to relaunch the Patreon, so I'll keep y'all posted on when that happens, of course, but in the meantime, I encourage you to go check out any of the other dozens of topics which I've discussed in hours of content which I've released over this year and some change of doing different things, whether it's the review stuff, the podcast, the IG Live stuffs, the interviews, anything that I've done. I've done quite a bit so far. So, be sure to check me out on Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, Applecast, Facebook. I'm everywhere. Okay? So, Samboy out. Thanks y'all for tuning in, and talk to you soon. Bye.